the system that we have, this debt system, is a form of bondage. It's a form of slavery. It's a way of controlling people. It's a way of keeping people locked in a very outdated paradigm. And it stops you from being able to essentially be your true self. What is the meaning of all this? Why are we here? Why do we have this? Well, why do we have this consciousness? That is the ultimate goal of life. And that has been so distorted and hidden from us. And I think once people start to create that space again and take these paths that we're suggesting, I think if people do truly go on that, they'll all of a sudden have the veil lifted from their eyes and they'll look back on their old life and say, I can't believe I ever lived that way.
Welcome to the Staying Free podcast. In this episode, I spoke with Mike, known as Parallel Mike on Twitter, who has a YouTube channel called Parallel Systems. I first came across Mike on Twitter when he posted a link to one of his videos in response to something about the housing market. And I went over and watched the video, and it was just such a good breakdown of the state of the housing market. And obviously it referenced the wider economy in general. And after watching a few more of Mike's videos, I realized there's a lot of signal there, and I really wanted to get him on the podcast. So I started this conversation about the housing market specifically because this is something I wanted to talk to Mike about and kind of elaborate on his video. But we ended up touching on a variety of themes and going into the whole state of the economy generally, as well as how that's going to affect people, and in particular how people can remain sovereign given everything that's coming down the line. Mike goes into his backstory about how he got to where he is today and some of the influences in his life that have led him here. And he also goes into some of what he's doing today to prepare for the economic storm that's coming. As you probably know by now, the podcast is not audio only anymore. You can also watch the video. At the moment, that's just on Odyssey, but I'll probably upload this to more video platforms going forward. I hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, please give it a share on social media. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please give it a 5-star review in whichever podcast platform you're using. And if you'd like to support the podcast, Bitcoin tips are on the Twitter page. And in the link in the bio there, you can also go to buy me a coffee and give a donation there. All donations are hugely appreciated and will go directly to the cost of running the podcast. All right, on to the episode. I've been listening to your YouTube channel, catching up on the videos. Your presenting style is really professional. It looks as if you maybe were a teacher in the past. Did you used to teach at all?
Oh, thanks very much. Actually, no, I was not a teacher, but I was for many years a mental health specialist. And I used to do a lot of group work with young people. So I guess some skills maybe in terms of presenting would develop from there. But I also think there's a lot of illusion because I'm terribly hard on myself when it comes to doing those things. I record till I get it exactly how I want it, and then usually it's never as I want it afterwards. But if I get close enough, 90%, 85%, I'm happy. So yeah, but some of those presenting skills, I guess, come from that time working with young people, sometimes having to present to classrooms or I remember we used to have to present to thousands of children at once sometimes. So yeah, a little bit of experience, I guess.
So yeah, let's start there with your past, because you told me a little bit about it over Twitter, but it's a really interesting story worth sharing. So before we go into all the kind of economic stuff that you talk about in your videos, could you just go into your history of kind of how you arrived at where you are now?
Yeah, it's quite a story. And I guess I'll try and keep it to the bits that are most relevant. But I guess my story is probably most influenced by my early years. I grew up in a very poor city, and it had an awful lot of social problems. It was actually voted the worst city in Europe at once, much to the delight of the people that lived there. It was a badge of honor. But so it was a difficult upbringing. And I guess I had two very different influential factors when it comes to finances in my life. Two experiences that I guess really conditioned my relationship with money. And that's the reason why I guess I'll discuss them. So one of them was my experiences growing up with my father. So he was actually very high up in what we'd call I guess in the US, they call it the mafia. In the UK, we call it a gangster. He was very high up in organized crime. So that was quite a unique upbringing, I guess, for a part of my childhood, up until the point where I actually got arrested and put in jail. But prior to that, I was very used to seeing lots of money, lots of cash around. My dad always had big rolls of £50 notes, thousands of pounds. You'd find it in in the cupboards, in the cookie jar. It was everywhere, and he was always carrying lots of money around with him. So I guess that gave me this understanding of money as something that was always abundant and free flowing, and you spent it. It was easy to come by. Now that all changed when my dad got sent away, and he got sent away for what at the time it was the largest ever smuggle of cannabis resin to the UK. So it was about £20 million in the money of the day. Today it's probably more closer to 40 million. So it's a substantial thing, and this was very, very highly publicized as well. So of course I had the same name as my dad. I was junior, he was senior. So it had a massive impact on my life in many, many ways, and it certainly framed my childhood. Now, this happened when I was around 12 years old, and following that, of course, that kind of experience of having money disappeared. My mum was a single mother. Her and my father had split up at this point, and my mum was working for minimum wage, supporting 4 children and living on a council estate. So it was a world away from that kind of early exposure to money. And I definitely say my experiences with my mum had the most significant impact on me, because I was conditioned to think that money was something that was very hard to come by. At the end of the month, there was nothing left. It was a desperate state, I guess. And I think I internalized that, and I took that with me throughout my life. And I also had some elements of this kind of, when you've got money, get rid of it, spend it. And there was never nothing left at the end of the month. Now, fortunately, I managed to avoid going down a similar path to my father, although at times it was difficult, because once my dad went to jail, I got kicked out of school. I missed out on most of my education. And were it not for the intervention of a mentor, somebody who was older, he was an art teacher actually, and he convinced me to go back to college, which I did. And then I got involved in sports soon after, and I found I had a particular gift for sport, something that I never knew I had. I got involved in boxing. I'd become quite good at that. And that gave me something to focus on, something that I could discipline myself with. And I ended up going to university, and everything kind of played on from there. And I actually became a mental health specialist working with young people. So this was, again, trying to leverage my own experiences to work with young people who had been through similar situations, who were brought up in poverty and maybe exposed to some of the things that I was exposed to. So money was not really something that ever motivated me, Johnny, to be honest. And it wasn't until my running career came to an end. Basically, in my mid-20s, I became involved in ultra running, and I found this was another passion. So I went part-time in my career so I could really focus on that. I knew at the time that if I really focused, that I could have a really good future in the sport. And again, it was a passion, same as my career. There was no financial reward from ultra running. There was no financial reward really from my profession either. It was just what I was passionate about doing, about creating meaningful experiences. Unfortunately, that came to an end. I got injured quite early in my career. Things were going very well up until that point. But once I got injured, it was just like a bit of a spiral. It took a year or so of trying all different kinds of therapy. And no matter what I did, I just found this path was essentially blocked. And it was around that time I actually met my wife, who then girlfriend. I'd gone back to working full time, realizing that running was just not my path. And we was both in this similar situation. We were stuck in life. We found that we were financially really struggling. We both had done all the right things. We'd gone to university, got our degrees, was working in the career that we planned to work in. And yet the prospect for us both to move in together at that point would have been 50% of our salary just on rent alone in the city where she worked. So it felt like a hopeless situation. And we understood that something was wrong. The social contract, as they call it, was broken in some way because our parents had afforded houses, Even my mum on minimum wage afforded a house eventually. So we knew something had changed, but I had no financial knowledge at all. And we kept going through this same conversation. We'd go to the pub and spend what little money we had at the end of the month, just drinking ale and whining about the situation, but we weren't coming up with solutions. And it was around that point I said to my girlfriend at the time, I said, listen, I've got an idea. We could move on to something like a boat. It'd be very, very cheap. I knew it would be super cheap. I said, if we do that, we could leverage our salaries. We haven't got much, but if we did that, we could dramatically reduce our monthly outgoings. And from that, create that excess cash to maybe do something with our lives, maybe save up a deposit. And I think she'd drunk enough ale that night that she agreed to it. She said, okay, let's give it a try just for a few months. And that's what we did. We found a really cheap, crappy old boat. It wasn't crappy, but it needed work, let's just say. We moved on to it. And that was really the start of my financial education, because all of a sudden, I realized that we was creating this excess. I think eventually we were saving 85% of our salaries, which, even if you had two people on minimum wage, that's an awful lot of excess money in comparison to somebody that's renting and throwing money away to a landlord. But the problem that I realized, Johnny, was that even though we were creating this excess, this early conditioning around money meant that I was still managing to get through that money and coming out with way, way less than I should have been at the end of the month. And this is when I realized that it was something psychological. It was something that I'd been programmed to do. I actually had to reprogram my relationship with money so that I could save. And the way I did that was to completely become obsessed with calculating everything. Where was my money going? Make it. And I did this for 3 months. I calculated everything, where everything was going. And I decided I was going to reduce that spending to the maximum. So really strict, really disciplined. And I realized that we could save a lot. That's when we got to that 85%. But from there, I was like, now what? We've got some money coming in, but I want to figure this out. Like, I knew people earned money from things like the stock market. I knew people invested money. And I thought, if other people can figure that out, why can't I? And this is essentially where the journey began for me. And it never stopped from there. Essentially, when I stopped running, I had this void in my life because I'd been so used to spending 60, 70 hours a week just focusing on that, whether it was training, reading, listening to podcasts. I completely orientated my life around that when I left that, I had this big gap. So essentially what I did was I said, right, I'm going to focus all my time on learning finances, financial history, monetary history, and figuring out this crazy world of finance that the whole world seemed to be completely tied into. And that's essentially where our journey began.
Wow. Okay. So it sounds like what you ended up discovering in terms of, rather than just getting yourself into debt, as most people do, is a way to kind of have a few upfront costs, i.e. the boat, etc., and then to save money down the line, which is essentially the Austrian, I know that a lot of your videos are themed around Austrian economics, essentially, as a school of economics as opposed to Keynesianism. And it almost seems like that experience for you might have been a window into that. Would I be right in saying that it's almost like you discovered what a lot of people never discover in their life, which is that reaping what you sow is really the way the world should be, rather than just taking out loads of debt and living above your means and then hoping your assets gain value. It's put in the work now and then bring your day-to-day expenses down as much as you can and then benefit from those investments down the line, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This was one of the key things that we both shared, me and my partner, was that we didn't want to become a slave to some mortgage, not particularly when we realized that the housing market was so extremely overvalued. And it was that sense of freedom that we wanted, that what we earned was ours and we was investing it in something that we owned. And that was really important to me. I guess I've always had this belief in life that the system that we have, this debt system, is a form of bondage. It's a form of slavery. It's a way of controlling people. It's a way of keeping people locked in a very outdated paradigm. And it stops you from being able to essentially be your true self. We sacrifice all of our time and money just to maintain this big level of debt that we have been conditioned to think is normal. But what we was really interested in, and what I was really interested in, was having freedom to be creative, to live the way that I wanted to live. And I realized that I could do that much better by reducing I wouldn't say quality of life, because living on the boat actually turned out to be one of the most enriching experiences of my life. There was a community. We learned that many of the things that you think you need to enjoy life or make life comfortable are actually unnecessary. That is not where the meaningful experiences come from. The meaningful experiences come from things that are experiential. And definitely the boat taught us that. And yeah, as I actually learnt more about economics, it was no surprise that it was the Austrian school of economics that was most appealing to me and most fit with my growing understanding of how the world not should be orientated, but how I found it most beneficial for my life, I guess, would be the best way of putting it.
Okay, great. Yeah. And I'm really glad that you did, because your YouTube videos are genuinely, I think, the best that I've seen anywhere when it comes to economics. The way that you present the information is just so good. And yeah, like huge credit. I think you deserve. I mean, it looks like it's growing from what I can see since I've been subscribed anyway. It looks like it's growing quite fast, but you definitely deserve a lot more followers on there just for the quality of content you're putting out. And I really want to get into that, actually, the actual economic stuff. So let's move on to it, because I have tons of questions. I was just kind of recapping on the video that you did, which was the first one that I watched of yours, which was the one about how I think it's called the UK housing market will crash, or something to that effect. I'm just hoping you can, I guess, summarize that thesis. Obviously, in that video, it's probably about 20 minutes long, and you use the full 20 minutes to explain it. If you're able to just kind of summarize the key points of why you think that's the case, and then I just want to kind of dive into the implications of that.
Sure. So I guess the way I approached the UK housing market was through my knowledge as an investor. So it was looking at things like cycles and valuations. And this is something that is often neglected in the UK housing market. There's a lot of mythology around the UK housing market about why it's growing. It's like this eternal spring of wealth for people. But it's really not the case, Johnny. When you look back through history, the UK housing market has been through very, very clear cycles. These were cycles where housing was undervalued, fair valued, overvalued, and then it would revert to the mean. This is what asset classes do. And only without some interference does that go wayward. And that is essentially what happened. In 2008, there was the great financial crisis. And the end result of that was the taking of interest rates down to close to zero, artificially repressing them, and the central banks essentially taking on lots of asset purchases and increasing the supply by quantitative easing. Now, the consequences of that was massive bubbles in the stock market, in housing, and in all kinds of asset classes, land, art, fine wines, because all of this money that they was printing was finding a home. Now, the UK housing market historically had always been on average around 4.2 times the average salary. Now, this wasn't a short-term cycle. This was a long-term cycle. Now, there was times when it was cheaper. It was undervalued. So it would have been undervalued around 3 times the average salary, and it would have been overvalued around 5 or 6 times. And about 5 or 6 was the maximum it ever went to. Excuse me. Now, after the great financial crisis, with all of this quantitative easing and this artificial repression of interest rates, that cycle was actually reverting prior to that to the mean. And what happened was the average price of the house just kept going up. The average price of the house in comparison to the average salary kept going up and up and up. And it got to the point where we are today, where we have the average UK house price at 11.5 times the average salary. Now, this is extraordinary. This is something that cycles do not do without some significant manipulation by governments. And that's what happened, of course, with the interest rates. So, of course, that cannot go on forever. At some point, there has to be some reckoning with this manipulation of the markets. Now, it's very difficult to predict exactly when that will happen, but we see signs all around us now that this game of quantitative easing and keeping interest rates artificially low is starting to come to its logical conclusion, which will be a market crash. And the reason we know that is because we have inflation back. And once inflation comes back, the way to reduce inflation is to dramatically increase interest rates. Now, because of the amount of debt they have pushed up to the sovereign level, so this is government debt, there is no chance we can increase interest rates anywhere close to what we would need to reduce the inflation that we are seeing. So the governments now, or the central banks, are really stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to interest rates. So they will increase interest rates and it will start to deflate the housing bubble. But there are many, many other risks as well for housing, particularly in the UK. And one of them would be the essentially inability of young people to get onto the housing market. because there's been so much speculation in housing by keeping interest rates low that many of the houses that were bought over the past decade were not by young people getting on the property ladder. They were by people speculating, people who could get very, very cheap loans and mortgages. So this was people who already had wealth and were maybe getting second or third houses. But of course, there was a massive consequence to this. This was young people who were now priced out of the market because unless they were willing to take on extraordinary amounts of debt to buy a house, they were essentially generation rent. And you had lots of people my age, when I was in my mid-20s, late 20s, who were living in very, very poor accommodation, living with mum and dad still, or having to do extraordinary things like we did, which was dramatically reduce our expenditure by doing something alternative, like living on a boat. So that's a good overview of how the market got to where it is now. And I guess in that video, what I discuss is why we are reaching that endgame scenario with not just UK housing, but also asset prices in terms of equities and all these other massive overvaluations. It's because essentially we've reached that end point in this game of printing money and keeping interest rates artificially low.
We've seen the stock market crashing really, really heavily. Have we already seen this any kind of crash in house prices so far? Because I can't see that there has been.
I don't think they've crashed. I think they've actually continued to go up. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but I guess a quirk of the housing market is actually one of the slowest markets to correct. And there's many reasons for that. But I guess to put it simply, when people buy a house that's overvalued, it can take an awfully long time for them to accept that the market conditions have changed. Because unlike things like the stock market, where the prices are dictated by the market itself, the housing market is dictated by the seller for a point. You know, this can go on for a year, 2 years, where somebody says, I paid this for my house and I refuse to sell it for anything less. And it can take maybe 2 years for them to slowly chip away till the market finds its equilibrium again and we find the true value of housing. Now, there's all kinds of schemes the government come up with to keep this the housing market artificially inflated. Now, in the UK particularly, this is something that the government are very interested in because it's the cause of the wealth effect for most baby boomers. This is what allows them to keep spending and putting money into the economy because they've got this wealth effect from housing. Now, if you remove that wealth effect from housing, this will be have a catastrophic impact on the UK economy. But it's the same in many countries as well, John. It's the same in Australia. It's the same in Canada, New Zealand. The US is back in a bubble. And we just found out this week, for example, that the Bank of England are now removing the requirement to assess the ability to pay for mortgages. So this is just another scheme of the government to interfere with the housing market. Well, the central bank, but I use that interchangeably, to artificially prop up this housing bubble. And that is, again, kicking that can further down the road. And we're going to essentially, maybe they'll squeeze another year or two out of it. Who knows? But all I can say is that the further this goes on, the bigger the reckoning will be. And of course, the more catastrophic that will be for anybody that bought into the housing market over the previous 4 or 5 years when they were buying them at such high multiples historically.
What was that last government scheme that you mentioned that they've introduced recently?
So the Bank of England have just announced in the past week that they are going to remove the requirement to assess the eligibility of people for mortgages. So essentially, they are saying that people who want to get a mortgage do not have to be assessed in the traditional way, where they would see if it was affordable for them. So this is, again, it's similar to what the US did with the subprime crisis, where they allowed people who it's slightly different because this is actually being done officially rather than the ratings agencies doing it. But what happened in the build-up to the great financial crisis was there was people who were not eligible really based on their incomes for mortgages being given mortgages and oftentimes multiple mortgages to speculate in the housing market. And of course, this created that massive bubble that eventually led to the subprime crisis in the US. So they haven't learned nothing from that. They're creating their own scheme now to make sure that the UK housing market goes that bit further. But of course, we'll get to see the consequences of that in the coming years.
Well, Mike, I don't know if it's that they haven't learned anything from it. I actually am much more of a conspiracy theorist on this. I think that this is a deliberate ploy, is to get everyone in insurmountable amounts of debt, because then they're easier to control. I mean, I don't want to go too far down the conspiracy hole, the conspiracy rabbit hole at this stage, but do you also have that suspicion?
100%, I would agree with that. I think it's kind of right now it's baked into the cake that there is going to be a massive destruction of wealth because the fiat monetary system is coming to its end. And worse than that, it's the dollar-based system. So it's not just our currency, it's across all the currencies, and all the central banks are working together to coordinate how they're going to manage this collapse of the dollar-based system. So they are very aware of what they're doing. This is not something that is ignorance or lack of understanding on their part. And what we're seeing is essentially people being put into situations where they are extremely exposed to the financial world. And of course, most asset classes are financialized. There's very, very little escape from that. So if they know this collapse is coming and they have no way of averting that catastrophe, what's the best way to do it? I guess that's the question they're asking themselves. And as far as I can see, the most likely scenario they would opt for is to have as many people caught up in that net as possible. So it creates at least equality amongst the destruction of wealth. If everyone's exposed, then they can come in and say, right, we're going to fix it for everyone, because otherwise it's a case of picking winners and losers. And if they are seeking to, for example, implement a central bank digital currency, the most simple way of achieving that would be to allow the current system to fail, and probably fail in something like a hyperinflation, because that would destroy the debt of governments, but it would also destroy the wealth of many people and essentially make them very vulnerable to having to accept this new system that would otherwise be something they would say, actually, I've got no interest in taking a central bank digital currency. But of course, if you've got an entire society whose pensions, house prices and savings have all been destroyed through something like a hyperinflation, then it engenders the situation where people have to accept the next stage, that next currency system that they're already setting up now. We know this is something that they're talking about with increasing frequency. Okay,
so going back to people who have got themselves in all this debt. I mean, you're in a position where you didn't do that. I haven't done that, got a mortgage and all the rest of it. And I'm like you, I'm very, very skeptical as to, well, not just skeptical. I think it's a bad idea. I think that the idea that debt has been normalized and that everyone is just okay taking out, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of debt when they have, a salary that does not come close to that is dangerous. Like, it's actually dangerous because, you're sitting on this asset and you are, like you said, you are kind of being set in a trap. But one of the things that you said in your video about the house market crash is that actually when you have hyperinflation coming down the line, one of the best things to do is to take out as much debt as possible, because the debt remains fixed whilst the assets will accrue in value. So I guess my question is, how do you reconcile those two things, i.e., they are devaluing the currency, and in which case it actually is in everyone's interest to just take out as much debt as possible, and the fact that if you are in loads of debt, that you essentially become a pawn in this big game and you become controllable and malleable by the government because you become a debt slave, essentially?
That's a very difficult question to answer. Of course, in a hyperinflation, winners and losers are picked somewhat at random. So depending on the person's situation, you could, for example, going into a hyperinflation, have millions and millions of pounds of debt. But if the currency hyperinflates at such a fast rate that your salary has to hyperinflate too, which is what happens. It might not keep up with the inflation, but the salary will hyperinflate. You could essentially pay off those millions of pounds worth of loans that you've got, or mortgages on houses, for what would essentially be a month's salary. And now I live in Poland and I know people that have lived through hyperinflations, and I know personal stories of people that managed to pay off house mortgages during the Polish hyperinflation of the late 1980s with a few months' salary. This has happened. So hyperinflations do pick winners and losers at random. Now, however, it's a dangerous game to try and play. Looking back at the Weimar hyperinflation, there was German industrialists who understood what was occurring very early in the cycle and took on significant amounts of debt to buy up real assets, knowing that at some point it was likely there'd be a hyperinflation and they'd be able to buy those assets for essentially pennies. But to try and play that game, to use that as strategically, would be very, very dangerous. And I think the situation we're in now, because it's something that's across many societies, it's essentially the whole Western civilization that is going to be a part of this. It makes it much more of a societal risk. There's going to be so much moral hazard involved, and the suffering that's going to come from that is going to be so catastrophic that I don't think anybody wins from that. Even if people manage to escape it themselves, or you might have some people that can ride that wave, like I said, by taking out debt early on. Potentially those people will exist. But I think ultimately the devastation from it will be so extreme that I don't think anybody wins from that situation. So I wouldn't advise people to frame it that way unless they've got a very, very high tolerance for risk, and maybe they're out of the mix of cities and things like this, where they can escape the financial devastation that would accrue.
Let's say I am a person who's got a 500 grand house, which was paid for with a mortgage that I'm going to pay back over however many years. And I'm expecting that my house price is going to go up, as they have been doing, whatever it is, 10, 15% a year or something. And then I actually find that because of the raising of interest rates, and because this kind of Ponzi scheme is being contracted because there's not as much cheap money available. And then I find that my house price drops. And not only mine, but everyone else's house price drops. And then as they see it dropping, they say, okay, well, I'm going to now need to sell my house to pay off my debt, because I can't have my, I need to sell my house because I need to pay for fuel or whatever. And if my house continues to go down in value, then, I'm not able to pay for things. So potentially you're going to have this kind of domino effect of everyone trying to sell, and then the whole thing comes crashing down. And even if it doesn't, even if 80%, given the amount of leverage that people have got, on their property, on this kind of mortgage that most people have got, that could mean that all of a sudden their house price goes down, let's say 100 grand. Well, you're now in 100 grand of debt, but you don't have the asset to fund it. Are most people realistically going to be able to work another, 4 or 5 years and have no other expenses in order to pay for that debt? The answer is likely no. So this is a long-winded way of the events that I think would happen. And the next event that I think would happen is that the government would come in and basically kind of rubber stamp these mortgages and say, don't worry, just like we did with the banks, where we, bought all of the debt and we essentially bailed out the banks and said, don't worry, everything's covered by us. Why couldn't they do the exact same thing for mortgages and come in and say, okay, well, we're not going to let the housing market collapse. It's too existential. We can't have people going into negative equity. So we are going to guarantee every single mortgage and essentially just pay for it. Nobody can sell at negative equity. The government will absolutely guarantee that any negative equity they have will be paid for by the government. Could you see that as a scenario? And if you can, where does that leave us? And if you can't, where does that leave us?
I think it's very difficult to predict how this collapse will be utilized by government to fulfill their own agendas. And we all know what those agendas are. Everyone now is aware of what's going on at the World Economic Forum, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Great Reset, whatever you want to call it. We understand that there is a greater agenda at play. It leads into Agenda 2030, Agenda 2050. And one of the key areas that they are looking to essentially revolutionize as part of this agenda is the relationship we have with ownership. Now, of course, not for them, that's for us. So it's how we own things. So potentially you could have a situation where there was this massive house crash, which we're both saying is probably going to be on the horizon. And at that point, you may get the government step in and say, we will bail you out. We will fix this because we can't have 10 million people homeless or whatever it would be at that point. Now, I would say almost certainly there would be some strings attached to that. Now, that may be the government taking an ownership stake in your house, which would be essentially you becoming a tenant of the government. And of course, this has already started to happen in Australia, where the house prices are so high that you have the Australian government now stepping in and saying to young people, we will take a 50, 60% ownership in your house and you can pay off the rest. And then later on you can start to pay us back for it. But of course, that puts you in this very, very difficult relationship with the government, where they now essentially have a very, very strong influence over your financial future. Our house is our number one asset for most people. And of course, if we look at the examples from 2020 and 2021 and how the governments became overtly totalitarian and sought to dominate the lives of the individual, would you, in that situation, where you, somebody that disagreed with what was going on, want to have the government having a financial stake in your house? Of course, nobody would want that. So it's difficult to predict exactly how it will play out, but we can see the trajectory, and we can already see this idea of ownership being something that is not a common good anymore. People shouldn't own things. We should have communal living, or we should have the government providing housing. This is something particularly young people are being indoctrinated to believe. And of course, this goes back to all different of these ideologies that are now spreading throughout society. And many of these ideologies actually come from the corruption of the government and the central banks of printing all this money. Where society not so distorted in terms of the financial system, young people would be able to have a quality of life. They would be able to afford a house. And I mean, to put it into context, Johnny, in the 1960s, the average age of first time buying when it comes to a house was 23. Today, it's close to 40. So that gives you an idea of just how corrupted the system has become. And of course, with that, young people become increasingly frustrated and angry, and that makes them very easy to condition to believe that it's not because of the central banks, it's not because of money printing. In fact, don't even learn anything about finance. Don't even look at that. It's to do with inequality, to do with gender and race and all these other ideas that are now becoming very, very prominent in society. And of course, society is more disharmonious now than it has been, at least in the last 100 years. Now, the last time we had societal inequality at this level, it's actually higher than then, but the last time we had it around these levels was in the build up to World War II. And it's this kind of crystallization of all this anger and frustration that certainly influenced Europe going towards this catastrophic end. And we've got inequality right now, at present, even higher than those levels. And of course, we're seeing all around us the consequences of that.
My belief is that money is like a communication medium. And if anything, money is probably it's probably a more useful communication medium almost than anything else. I mean, most people, if you think of a communication medium like a language or something, they think, okay, well, language is above everything. But actually, like, we can understand value far easier than we can understand language. Like, you can go to anywhere in the world and you can pick up notes and stuff, and you can see the numbers on them, and you can, even if the numbers weren't there, maybe you've got shells, maybe you've got coins, maybe you're comparing shininess. Most people will be able to communicate value through those things and to trade them, and people understand it. And then, we've kind of gone through this whole era of human history and the gold standard and everything. And then you kind of come up to, the 1970s maybe, or perhaps even earlier than that. And all of a sudden we kind of go off this gold standard onto this fiat standard. And you have a situation whereby everything was turned on its head economically, right? You have money being, debt essentially is money. Money is just, okay, well, we just invent numbers on a screen and then say, okay, now you can have a house for it, and then you've got to make it up. And actually, like, it completely caused this disconnect. Whereas it used to be that, like I was saying before about you reap what you sow. You do the work and then you get something from it. Well, now it's you get the money first, you get the reward first, you get the thing you should be working for first, and then you buy the asset with it. Right. So everything flips on its head. And I find this a really interesting relationship that you have between the fundamental communication medium, i.e. money, being corrupted. It seems to have caused a downstream corruption of the whole of society, the whole of culture, the whole of the way that we interact and our values and all the rest of it. Do you sense that as well?
I would agree with that for sure. I think when the monetary system becomes corrupted and you go onto this fiat monetary system, which we've had since 1971, of course, that allows the corruption at the upper echelons of society to run rampant because there is no limiter. Without the gold standard, there was no limiter on what governments could do with money. They could print it. And then, of course, the corruption and the rot really sets in because they can pick who wins and who loses. They can ensure that their friends get easy access to money before inflation comes in. And what they start to do is then kick the can down the road, and then they start to support people who are going to be the biggest voting base, essentially. So for our lives, it was the baby boomers. So it was ensuring that the baby boomers were well kept for, but the young people were the ones who got shafted in that scenario. And then you get generations of people growing up with this kind of boom and bust mentality that the monetary system goes through itself. So we all live now in this world where people believe that the route to financial freedom is to OnlyFans or some kind of, get rich quick scheme, Instagram influencers or whatever it is. And this is all, like you said, it's downstream from the corruption of the monetary system. And I think in the coming years, we're going to see a massive reversion back the other way. And you saw this in societies that lived through hyperinflation. So if you look at Germany after the Weimar hyperinflation, they became very, very debt averse. Society did not want debt. They became very, very strict. And you see that even today. The Germans are very, very against taking on more debt. And this is a key problem in the European Union, in that the Germans are like the financial limiter on the ECB, expanding the money supply as much as they can. Now, they haven't done a very good job, but they certainly raise complaints a lot. And it's the same in Poland. Poland lived through a hyperinflation. Many, many people in Poland are very, very debt averse. And this actually plays out in the culture too. Poland is still a conservative culture. And they are certainly against much of this modern ideology, such as the LGBTQ plus lobby and all of these ideas around gender and, going away from traditionalism towards something much more radical. So again, it's the way people have a relationship with money. Like you said, it has a massive impact on how people behave in society. So in Poland, debt levels are very low in comparison, personal debt levels in comparison to the West, where we were brought up in this era of easy money. You buy things on credit, instant gratification. And of course, that transcended into our culture too. Whereas a more conservative society like Poland, the relationship they have with debt is actually the same cultural values they have too. So it's a more conservative culture. People get married young. It's not as interested in maybe discussing all things to do with our sexuality and gender. It's like, this is seen as a private thing. So it's on a very different track. And again, you see that with there's parallels between what's happening with the money and what's happening in wider culture as well.
Do you know what the average household debt is in Poland?
I'm not sure what the average household debt is in Poland, but I can speak anecdotally, I guess is the best way to look at it, is that the people who lived through the inflation of the 1990s, they became very debt averse and they become very fearful of debt and money itself. Actually, it really changes the psychology of a country when they live through a hyperinflation. Now, to give an example, my father-in-law, he became slightly obsessed with paper money. He started collecting it and now he's got a massive collection and he studies money. And this is how it changes people's inner psychology, because your relationship with money is forever dented. And one of the things that you see in Poland is people are very, very reluctant to throw anything away, especially the older generation that lived through the hyperinflation. If you look in their garages and their houses, they don't throw anything away. They've got boxes around filled with all kinds of things that in the West would have been disposed of decades ago. And again, it's this hoarding mentality, trying to keep anything that might have value, because in the hyperinflation and through, particularly throughout communism, things were so scarce, goods were so scarce that people didn't have anything. So the savings rate in Poland is much higher and it's much harder to get a mortgage. We was looking into this just recently to try and compare it to the UK. And to get a mortgage in Poland right now, you can only get a fixed rate mortgage for 5 years. Then it goes on to a variable rate no matter what. And the deposit requirements are much, much higher. So you're talking maybe 30-40% in terms of a deposit. So if you contrast that to the UK, who are actually taking away the standards for mortgage requirements and reducing it, so there's going to be, maybe I predict it'll be around a 5% deposit again to make it easy for people to get on. So again, it's this different culture and mindset, and I think this is going to lead to a complete rebalancing of societies across Europe about the positions that societies are in right now and how wealthy societies are. That's all going to change in the coming decades. That's one of my predictions, particularly with Eastern Europe and Central Europe, these societies that suffered under communism and had their their growth basically repressed for over 50 years, they are going to be the winners in the coming few decades. And the societies that had this period of freedom and neoliberalism, those are the ones that will suffer the most. It'll be this kind of swing in both directions for each society.
Yeah. I mean, I've brought this up before on the podcast, mainly referencing Vietnam. And, I'm not sure, have you been to Vietnam by any chance?
Never.
Well, anyway, the way that they live over there, obviously the average person would just think, okay, well, they're just really poor, they have a low quality of life, etc. But most people there, they own the property, and they will own not only their own property, but they'll own the land as well. Sometimes it's passed down, through the family. Families like live together and stuff. They don't have much household debt. So yeah, okay, they have less disposable income. They have less actual cash, but they have very, very few expenses. Even the businesses, they generally, like, people own their own businesses. It's a small business culture over there, and the way the culture has developed is just completely different. I mean, even in Mexico, I just noticed living there that so many people will live with their parents or whatever until they're like 30, but they're not getting in the debt. And I've had this conversation with people here who've said, oh, well, would you want that? Would you want to have to live with your parents till you're 30 or whatever? And I guess my thought around that is, like, if that's what is economically rational, if that is actually the way that society would emerge, if you didn't have this false economy of debt, then yes, we probably should live like that, because the alternative is that we essentially are living way above our means, but it's all a false economy. And I actually think that, I heard this term empire of lies recently. I'm not sure what it was actually in reference to, but that I just think that is a poignant term to actually describe the Western societies that we are so accustomed to believing are, the first world, essentially, because so much of it is based upon funny money. Basically, it's based on debt. It's based on falsehoods. It's not based on saving and owning stuff. Everyone's just, in these heaps of debt, but living, on the surface, a good lifestyle. But actually, if you dig below it, then there's no stability there. It's built on really, really shaky foundations, essentially. And I wonder whether, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, whether the next kind of epoch of human history, that some of these countries that we've come to think of as the third world, the developing world, or whatever, will come out really, really well when this whole fiat system comes collapsing or collapses.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, because the way I view most things in the world is cyclical. We live in a world that's cyclical, and even going back to the Bible, he who was first will come last, and who was last will come first. And that is just the way empires rise and fall as well. At some point there is a decline. Now, we saw that after the British Empire, with the transition of power post World War II to the Americans, and they took on the reserve currency. And since that time, since the 1960s, particularly, the British standard of living has decreased significantly. And the reason why people have this appearance of a good quality of life is because real wealth has been replaced by artificial wealth, which is debt. We see, that's why people have such leverage to debt now in terms of their quality of life. Most things are bought on credit, and people have been conditioned to believe that that is the way. Now, of course, when that cycle reverses strongly in the opposite direction and debt has to be paid, then you see massive wealth destruction. And that is one way that would quickly destroy the standard of living in a country like the UK. Now, like you said, going back to societies where debt was hard to come by and it was actually seen as something shameful or not to have, and these societies got by with less, they often, by default, they have managed to give themselves some level of insulation and protection from a major global crisis. Because to give you an example, where I live, it's a poor rural community, really. People here would not be considered wealthy by the standards of somebody in the West in terms of maybe material goods, consumption items. But in terms of real wealth, as I see it, which would be land ownership, the ability to provide for yourself in terms of food, to grow healthy, real food, the ability to use a well so you don't have to pay for water, off-grid solutions to power your house in a power outage. Everyone where I live has these things. And looking back historically, Johnny, it was always the case that your access to land was a determinant in your level of freedom as a citizen. And this has not changed at all. What's changed is our view of wealth. So we view wealth today as the accumulation of things, goods. But historically and going forward, it will be the people that have access to land, access to some form of self-sufficiency, where the real quality of life is maintained. And the people that are exposed to debt and maybe have a house full of technology and goods will realize what real wealth is. And I don't think that will be in the items that they were buying. It will be in their ability to provide for themselves. Where I live, people, if you took away the food tomorrow, if you turned off the power tomorrow, if you turned off the water tomorrow, life would go on pretty much the same for 90% of people here. And the other remaining 10%, there'd be more than enough people within the community to bail them out. Now, if you did that in a city today, where people have become conditioned to this modern way of living, well, it would be hell, wouldn't it? It would be absolute catastrophe. So I think we're going to see the way people view wealth and the way people allocate their wealth going forward, if it is in fact possible, if it's not destroyed, will be vastly different to what we've seen in our lifetimes thus far.
So that I agree that is about the best case scenario, is that we kind of have a reversion to that. But do you not see this, this is something that I'd love to see, you'd love to see, and probably a lot of the people listening to this would also love to see that kind of thing. But keeping in mind that most people, they don't even know that there is some kind of war going on their, on their finances, on their sovereignty, all the rest of it. Do you not think that so many people will sleepwalk into a world in which, rather than doing that, they'll just accept, okay, well, I'll just I'll take a mortgage out that's 20 times my salary, and if the government wants to own a bit of my property, then that's absolutely fine. They can own their 20% share, and then it'll go up to 30%, and then before you know it, the government basically owns the whole thing, and you get to live in it, and everything is a completely permissioned society where you are, a subject, and you live in a kind of feudal society. Not to go too black pill on it, but we have to also kind of consider the other side of this equation, because it's almost like, we could go in two directions here. We could go into a new era of self-sovereignty and communalism and things like this, localism, or we could go into a very, very dark world, which it seems like a lot of people want to push, which is that you will own nothing and be happy, essentially. How do we avoid that scenario, and how do we create the world that we actually want to create?
Well, that's quite a question. I think, unfortunately, you're right. Many people will be wiped out. I'd say the vast majority of society will be wiped out because what's coming is so catastrophic. It's the end of a monetary system. And many of the things that we are seeing take place in the world right now is to prepare and condition society for that ultimate climactic end to the monetary system. Now, you could frame what happened between 2020 and 2021 as a form of conditioning for the control mechanisms that are going to be implemented during that stage. Because if you imagine it, when this system comes crashing down, you're going to have people who are very, very angry, people who are suffering financially, emotionally, and potentially facing all kinds of shortages. This is going to be a very, very difficult time for society. And it has the potential for all kinds of black swan events, uprisings, violence. Now, of course, the government of the world are going to have to implement very, very strict controls on society at that point. Things such as lockdowns, staying at home, basically telling society what you must do and when. This is how we're going to solve it. You must give up your autonomy so we can save you. This will be the process that people have to go through. And every step will be hidden. It'll be something that comes step by step, where people are completely focused and tuned in to the mainstream media and the daily government press conferences. So almost in some ways, you can see what happened between 2020 and 2021 as a phony war, building people up, getting people psychologically prepared for what we're speaking about. Now, of course, there are some people along the way that are going to become well aware of where this is heading. And you're seeing that online. There's a growing number of people. I don't like to use the word waking up. I like to say resensitized, because what's essentially happened, what we're talking about, is that over the past 30, 40 years, people have become desensitized to what's real, to reality, to human connection, real food, real medicine, to health. And we've become so desensitized that we have allowed our society to become utterly corrupted by these kleptocrats and oligarchs. And we all think it's normal until we wake up out of it and don't. So I try not use wake up just because I know some people don't like that. So I say resensitize. We're resensitizing ourselves to what things should be like. And those people that are doing that are making those decisions to go back to the land, to grow their own food, to create their own communities outside of that, so they're not so dependent on society. Because anything that they can manipulate and control in the coming years, they will use that, as they did during 2020 and 2021, to leverage your obedience in whatever agenda they come up with. So, my belief is anyone who has become resensitized and is ready to make that shift, that's what you need to do. And the rest of it the chips will fall where they fall. We cannot control that. All we can control is what's within our power. And I think in the coming years, my hope is that as many people as possible realize what's going on, because time's running out. I think we both recognize that there's not much longer before this current system comes to its inevitable conclusion. And I just hope as many people as possible come along the way. And I guess that was one of the reasons why I started my program on YouTube, my Parallel Systems, was to help people understand what's happening, where it's going, and what they might do now to try and protect themselves and get out of it before they get caught up in what I say is the flood. It's like Noah's Ark, isn't it? It's like there's a flood coming. You need to build your ark now to protect yourself during that period. And it's going to be very difficult for all of us, but some of us will come out of it much worse for wear than others, depending on how much we trusted. How much did we trust our central planners and our governments?
Yeah. So going back to your channel, actually, I was watching a video on there, I think yesterday, and you were showing around some of the areas where the food is grown and things like that in the community. And I think you had your own little lot there or something. What is it? What's it like over there, and what is it you're kind of personally building? Because it looks like you're really, really taking decisive action about this. You're not someone who is kind of speaking about these issues and not really doing enough. Like I kind of feel like I'm in that boat. I'm looking down the barrel of a gun, and I know I've not done enough in my own life personally to actually kind of prepare for it. But you're someone who really has done those things and kind of put in the work to make yourself more sovereign and to insulate yourself. So what's it like? What's life like over there in Poland, and specifically what you're doing to insulate yourself?
Well, I guess for me, Johnny, going into 2019, me and my partner, me and my wife, we both felt that something really dark and bad was on the horizon. We knew all about the Fiat monetary system. We knew where it was heading, and we knew that this reckoning was close, and we could see the signs in the financial markets. Now, I think a lot of people misunderstand what is essentially a knowledge of the monetary system for conspiracy, because they think it can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. But once you look into the history of money and the history of the monetary system, you realize exactly, it kind of fills in the blank in history. It makes you understand why history took a certain path and where we're heading as well. It fills in the blanks. So I would certainly say that to anybody that's concerned by this information but is maybe tempted to disregard it, begin by looking at the history of money. Start there. That's the best place to start, because it's factual, it's based in reality, and it allows you to chart that course. Now, for us, going into 2019, we had this really strong sense that we was arriving towards that end game point, and that something big was coming. Funnily enough, my wife, who's an artist, she actually had a very vivid dream, and I remember one morning driving from the boat. It was pitch black in winter. We had a really long commute. It was a bit, we used to commute 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. And she was recounting this dream that she had. And she said, something had arrived in society, something happened, and everyone was losing their mind. They was like hypnotized, and they was all running towards something that was really dark and was going to hurt them. And we couldn't wake them up. People were just hypnotized by this like evil energy, and we escaped it by running the opposite way. That was what saved us. And looking back on that dream now, after what happened just around the corner in 2020, it was very, very accurate in terms of its description. Now, this dream really, it stuck with me because the way she described it was so vivid. I could tell it had affected her, and I guess that was our cue to get out of Dodge and start making that plan for an ultimate shift, where we would leave behind our lives in society as we was living it. This I wouldn't say 9 to 5. It was more like 6 to 8. We was really working hard. But we created this plan and our goals, and we knew that in the coming years, what was going to be most important was having that self-sufficiency, so we wasn't so easily controlled during this collapse moment, so that we wasn't forced into a situation that we didn't want to be in. And I realized that in the UK, this would be very, very difficult to achieve because land prices are very, very high in the UK. At that point, we'd kind of achieved our financial goals in terms of our outlook. And if we'd have stayed in the UK for another, say, 4 or 5 years, because we'd managed to figure out our way of succeeding, that would have been awesome. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to move to Poland, but then come back to work and do kind of shifts between the two countries. Now, of course, once COVID hit, we realized that that was impossible and that they were moving much more rapidly than even I predicted. Now, I was quite a pessimist, but 2020 was even took me by shock, just how quick they acted to remove our freedoms, remove our ability to travel. And I saw then that this path that I was kind of charting in my own mind that I was predicting, it was going to move much faster. So I was like, right, we need to move soon. And we did that. And we moved to our own farm, a small organic farm where we can grow our own food. We've got control of our own energy, solar power. We've got our own well. And essentially, we started to create this small community around us also, bringing other people into the fold, neighbors. It was something that kind of developed organically. We had this idea for the farm, but in terms of the other people coming in, I realized that, escaping is not the solution here. If we just try and escape and fix it for ourselves, well, first of all, it won't work because essentially their plan is to control all life on this planet. All living beings, all life forms on this planet, they want full control over that. So first and foremost, if you try and just escape, you buy yourself some time, but essentially, eventually they'll come for you also. And who wants to live like that, hiding, fearful? What we need to do is create an alternative vision and try and draw other people in. So that's what we started to do here in our community. We got to know the local community, the local farming community, our neighbors. We started to create trade with one another, giving gifts, food, fish, whatever it is, and create that kind of culture that will keep us secure should the worst happen. We've already got some people that understand what we're about, we understand what they're about, and it's good relationships. And I think that's really key, is creating a community around you. And, can you do that in a city? Maybe. But I think the cities are going to be particularly hard for people because that is where most of the mechanisms of control exists, things like surveillance, facial recognition. And once they start to enroll these smart cities with 5G, QR codes, it'll be very, very easy to box someone in and force their compliance. Whereas if you go as far away as is feasible from that to communities that are more self-sufficient and are used to not having to engage so much with the state, then I think you'll buy yourself much more time. And that's what we need essentially. We need to buy more time to draw more people into the alternative and to the solutions than people who are currently maybe ignorant of what's coming and sadly are going to be right in the firing line. We need to give them time to experience just what is truly happening and allow them time to basically see what we're doing and see what the governments are offering them and say, knack us to that. I don't want nothing to do with this dystopia and I'm joining these guys. And I think we will see that over time, but it will be a process. It's not going to happen overnight.
It's almost as if the antidote to this kind of fake growth that we've had in previous years, all based on debt and all based on, money printing and all the rest of it. It's like the antidote is real growth. Like the only way that you can survive this collapse is to kind of grow your actual real productive, I don't want to use the word assets because so much is lumped in with that, with things like stocks and stuff, but it's almost like things that actually contribute to your day-to-day life, growing your own food, owning your property, etc., having a community around you, people that you can trade with, that seems to be the antidote, which is, I guess it's not really an ironic thing, because that's exactly what you'd expect, right? Like when you have a world based on so many lies, whether that's kind of, financial or otherwise, the antidote to it is just real living. It's just real life. It's just the things that, we've done for hundreds and thousands of years. That's the way that you survive the collapse. You just go back to that. It's almost like everything else shrinks away, and you kind of come back to this core center of things that have always been important and always been true.
That's a very beautiful way of putting it. And it's funny because the answers are so simple, right? It's going back to how humans have always lived. We've always took care of ourselves within communities, taking care of our own needs when it comes to food, taking care of our own needs when it comes to culture and entertainment. But we have essentially allowed ourselves to be lulled into a world where these things are outsourced. And we've outsourced so much of our life that this has allowed the world around us to be subtly corrupted over time. And that's led to where we are now. And people are very dependent on essentially powers outside of their small communities and real world for everything. We outsource our entertainment is given through the mass media, our news, our social connections now. It's all technological. It's all online. Our food, it comes from all over the world and it's shipped in and it gets put on these supply chains that take thousands of miles to arrive. And we've outsourced everything. And this makes us extremely vulnerable to what we saw in 2020 and 2021, where the governments come at us and say, actually, we're in control now, and this thing you have called democracy, well, we're suspending that because we've got something that's more important. And that's what happened. And people all of a sudden realized just how vulnerable it was. But the solutions are very simple. Like you said, it's going back to tried and tested methods, to real knowledge, and like you said, real wealth is actually the ability to provide for yourself. What is the point in us having millions of pounds in the bank or stacks of gold bars or an account full of Bitcoin if that is not enhancing our ability to connect with one another, to be food secure, to be healthy, to be growing our own foods that actually act as medicines for us? If we are not, wealth accumulation is not the goal here. That is just a tool, which is going back to what you said earlier. It's a way of communicating. It's a tool, but just accumulating wealth, essentially, that is what we've been indoctrinated to believe, that is the goal. But that's not the goal. The goal is to create the space to have more connection, more community, and essentially, like ultimately, to take a spiritual path, to figure out why we are here. What is the meaning of all this? Why are we here? Why do we have this? Well, why do we have this consciousness? That is the ultimate goal of life. And that has been so distorted and hidden from us. And I think once people start to create that space again and take these paths that we're suggesting, I think if people do truly go on that, they'll all of a sudden have the veil lifted from their eyes and they'll look back on their old life and say, I can't believe I ever lived that way. I can't believe that I actually thought those things were normal. But it takes some time removed from that system, which is so full of propaganda and so full of messaging that is essentially there to maintain this status quo and these belief systems. Once you extricate yourself from that, all of a sudden, your whole worldview starts to change very quickly. And my hope is that if people start to explore these alternative ideas, because they are still very alternative to the mainstream, then we may have that domino effect where quite quickly this energy of not fear, not desperation, but this energy of let's call it maybe even a spiritual awakening starts to feed through society, and that positive feedback loop could happen. And I think it could happen very quickly if the conditions were right. But first and foremost, you need to remove yourself from this toxic system that sadly has taken hold across the entire Western civilization.
Yeah, that was really well put. I definitely agree that one of the silver linings of this whole transition that we're having, this counterculture which is building, and people becoming more sovereign, kind of out of hardship and out of necessity. But I definitely think that on the other side of that, people might actually find meaning. When people start getting their hands in the soil and growing their own food, and meeting their neighbors and trading one to one, etc. Like, they might end up finding, wow, like, what were we doing? Because I definitely think that's coming. We're actually going to look back, and all of these times of just chasing the latest technological hype or whatever it is, we might just look back on that and go, wow, like, that was like a dark age for us. We might look back on Fiat times like a dark age, and then we're like, oh yeah, we've rediscovered what humanity is about now. We've rediscovered community. We've rediscovered family and all this kind of stuff. And just pursuit of meaning and pursuit of truth, and living day to day, providing for yourself, being free. If this is what it takes for people to finally become free, then great. I mean, in one of your videos, you were talking about, I think it was the house price one again. You were talking about like the reversion to the mean. And I almost view freedom as that. It's like we've reverted away from the mean so far when it comes to freedom. We've gone into this crazy world where everything's become centralized, and we've relied on these centralized institutions and figures, and there's fiat money printing where you don't even have control of your own value. Someone can go and hit a button on a keyboard, and all of a sudden they've just created the same amount of money that it might have taken you your entire life to earn. All of this kind of craziness is just we have the opportunity to kind of come back, and actually, like, it is like a regression. I don't know whether regression maybe sounds too negative, but it's a reversion perhaps to the mean on a freedom level. There is, I think, in everyone a drive to be free and to be sovereign in all these things, and maybe it's just going to take a kind of a shaking of the snow globe, so to speak, to kind of for everyone, for the kind of dust to settle, and for everyone to say, okay, like, I did value freedom after all. Maybe this is what it takes. And some of my previous conversations have actually touched on that. There's one with a guy called Joel Rafidi. I'm not sure if you've listened to that one, but he talks about this idea that it's like we needed this kind of collective reckoning in order to come back to a place of spirituality and of meaning, of purpose, and that it might look nasty, it might look scary, etc. But actually, on the other side of that, not only do you have freedom, but you kind of become connected to the essence of what it is to be a human as well.
Yeah, and history is very clear on this as well, Johnny. If you look back at the European experience of totalitarianism, which was very, very recent, it only ended in 1989. MTV existed in the West when people were still living under a totalitarian dictatorship in Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia. So if you look back at how that played out, it started very much like what we are seeing now. It started with small islands of freedom that were created, small pockets of people who refused to take that path, who from the very beginning opposed it. And those people, it was hard. It came down, but they carried that flame, that torch of freedom throughout that entire period from the end of the 1940s all the way to 1989. And over that time, they managed to basically draw in other people. As more and more people become aware of just how distorted and gross society was becoming, they decided we're going to join them, and that's how the movements began. Now, it doesn't mean it's an easy road. It can take a long, long time, but over time, it's the people who start those movements that will ensure that it does actually end. So it's certainly not a hopeless case, but I do think the quicker people choose to act, and that's what it is, because remember, during communism, they didn't care if people actually truly believed the ideology. In fact, it was almost taken as a given by the central planners that people didn't believe it. All they cared about was people following it, this obedience. That's all they cared about. People turning up at the parades, and there was parades all the time. People had to go along, they had to clap and smile, and then they went home and were miserable about it, but they just played along. Everything became a theater. And where have we seen that recently? And over time, people developed the confidence to stand with the people who opposed it. That's what happened. So this is a period of growth, and we all have to find within us that courage to actually say, I don't agree with what's going on. I don't enjoy it. But it's very hard because you've got to overcome all of these psychological mechanisms that have been put in us for caring about what other people think, not wanting to stand out from the crowd, believing that we're small, that we're not worthy of having freedom, and we're not worthy of taking back control over our lives. This, I guess, denying our responsibility. We're all born with a responsibility to contribute to the world, to make use of our life. But it's much easier for us to shy away from that responsibility because it's a very, very hard thing to adopt. You have to then you become hyper aware that everything you do has a consequence on this planet and on each other. So it's much easier for people to say, actually, I'll outsource that responsibility to some utopian idea or the government. But I think what we're going to see is many, many more people over time developing that confidence to actually say, I've had enough. I actually had a conversation with someone not so long ago, and he was building his own kind of homestead and this community for people to come and escape the society that we're talking about, this toxic one. And he told me that he had a really vivid dream, and he said he realized that people were like kennels of corn in the microwave, and he said this is how he saw the future. It starts off when it heats up, just a few awaken, just a few pop open, but at some point a critical mass is arrived at, and it's happening everywhere, and there's all across the world people are lighting up and realizing that the way they've been living is wrong, that there's these systems of control that have been dominating all of life for thousands of years. We call them elites, we can call them what we want, but we understand what we're talking about, that there's people out there who have a dark agenda and they just seek to control the rest of humanity. They believe that's their God-given right. And he said eventually it's just this mass effect where everyone's waking up. But he said there are some that will go black and burn and will never wake up. And sadly, that's the case. Unfortunately, it's not going to be everyone that makes it out of this. So I guess for me, I'm not looking, when I'm talking about finance and all of those things, it's not about, creating lots of wealth for myself or anything like that. I'm really not interested. What I'm interested about is trying to be a part of that movement of helping people to arrive at the same point where they understand what's happening and they can extricate themselves from that system.
Yeah, well, you are a really, really strong part of that. I know that your YouTube channel has already got quite a lot of subscribers, but yeah, I mean, I can't recommend enough to my listeners just to, how much they should check out your YouTube channel, because, it's really great. Every single video that I've watched has just been like so well thought through and so well presented. So keep doing what you're doing. It's really awesome. I'm going to let you sign this off. I still feel like there's so many other avenues that we could have covered, and I hope that we'll have further conversations down the line, because this has been great, but I feel like we've almost only scratched the surface here. But I'll let you sign it off, I guess, first of all by saying where people can find you, and then if you can also just kind of give people a bit of a parting message as well. But yeah, thanks so much from me for coming on. I've really appreciated this conversation, and I hope we speak again.
Awesome. Thanks, Johnny. No, thank you for the invite. It's been really awesome to talk to you. And I think this is a really positive sign that there are more and more people stepping into the fold, putting out these messages, trying to share different visions. I think this is what motivates me to see stuff like this. And I find your podcast is really reassuring, listening to all these different voices. It's a very exciting time. There's a lot of darkness out there, no doubt, but it's also a very exciting time. And I never expected that I'd have a YouTube channel or anything like that. It wasn't something that was particularly on my radar, but at some point I got to the point where I decided, if I don't contribute in some other way, then what am I doing here? I'm just kind of living in my own little bubble. So that's where it came from. And it's probably not long for this world. Listen, YouTube is a platform that we know censors quite a lot. So I guess I need to diversify on that one and maybe put it out onto a podcast stream. So I'm hoping to do that as well. And so I guess you can catch me for now on Parallel Systems Broadcast on YouTube. And hopefully by the end of this week, that'll be available on just your typical podcast platforms as well, such as on Apple, iTunes, and all the rest of them. And I guess parting words would be, there is always time to make that change. Things are changing rapidly, right? And they can change overnight. That's just the nature of this chaotic kind of part of this cycle that we're currently in. But you always have power over your own being. That is your choice. You can make psychological changes, even if you can't make physical changes. And I think that's just as important, if not more important. So I would suggest that if anyone is worried, don't allow yourself to be drawn into that world of fear and anxiety. Take control of what you can and take it step by step. Reach out to other people online. Keep listening to voices like Johnny's. And there's plenty of other people out there. And you don't need monetary wealth to escape what's coming. What you really need is intention. You need the right intention. You need to be aware of what's going on and then reach out, because there's plenty of people out there who will be very, very happy to help you make the change that they've maybe perhaps already made.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike.
Cheers, Johnny.